Hi, Dr. Barry here again. I hope that everyone is staying safe and healthy. What I'm going to discuss in the following video was inspired by some thinking on the fundamental biological mechanisms by which the coronavirus works. And a friend of mine named Bruce Schroeder asked me my thoughts on this. He was informed by a member of our network named Ray Straub, who's in contact with a guy named Andy that operates under a cover name, Liberty Mavenstock. And that's all I'm going to say about that. But Bruce was wondering what I thought of this fundamental mechanism of how the coronavirus actually operates. Now, I'm not really sure of why this particular strain of the coronavirus has so many of the medical experts fooled. And believe me when I tell you that I have no problem conceding that some of them have much more experience in this area than I do. That's not to say they have more education, but simply more hands-on experience. But the reason that I mention this is because I want everyone to understand the basics of comparison. Even though I've had over 24 years of formal medical training, and God knows how many classes on biochemistry, I'm not any smarter than anyone else that's been taught that a single molecule of water, H2O, is composed of 2 atoms of hydrogen and 1 of oxygen. Any of you listening to this video understand that just as well as I do, regardless of you having attended medical school or not. We have common sense. And my point is that once you understand the process of any particular activity, whether it's making toast, in a toaster, you set the desired darkness, you put in the slices of bread, you push down the lever and the heating element inside the toaster heats up, and the timer automatically shuts it off and releases the lever when it's finished, and the toast pops up. It's a process. It's a simple process. So in the case of something a little more complicated, oxygen, the process of oxygen exchange of the red blood cells in the lungs, yes, it's a little more complicated, but still it's a simple process when the basic fundamentals are understood. So I'm going to do my best to break it down into simplistic layman's terms for those of you who truly want to have a better understanding of what is actually causing people to die from COVID-19, which is the name of the disease, not the virus, but the disease that results from an infection of this particular strain of the coronavirus, which is named SARS-CoV-2. So the disease is called COVID-19. It was previously called 2019 novel coronavirus, but now it's just called COVID-19. But the name of the virus that causes this disease is named Severe Acute Respiratory Syndrome Coronavirus 2, or SARS-CoV-2. So now that we understand the difference between the name of the disease and the name of the virus that causes the disease, let's look at the process of what actually happens. In the last week on the news channels, there's been a huge amount of anecdotal, as some say, evidence that's come to light about COVID-19, the disease, and characteristics of those patients who get seriously ill and unfortunately die. The information is not only accumulating, but it's now beginning to generate a field-level consensus supported by a few clinical studies and the understanding of the fundamental process of oxygen exchange in the lungs. Now, I truly believe the experts, meaning experts, those that have the connections to gain notoriety and be appointed to high-level government positions on a task force and on medical teams, they have had it all wrong this entire time. Of course, there were a few that had some things very correct, even those without specific medical training, but they had common sense. President Trump, for example, by closing the border with China early, and especially the use of hydroxychloroquine with azithromycin and zinc. But we'll get to that in a minute. Right now, each of us should understand that there is no pneumonia nor ARDS, ARDS, acute respiratory distress syndrome, that's occurring. At least not the ARDS that we're familiar with and that we've established treatment protocols and procedures for. Ventilators are not only the wrong solution, but high pressure intubation, inserting a breathing tube down the throat into the air passage and forcing pressurized oxygen into the lungs can actually wind up causing more damage than not doing that. And this doesn't even include the complications that can arise from tracheal scarring and ulcers, considering the duration or time of intubation required. Dr. Cameron Kyle Siddell, who's treating COVID-19 patients in New York City, actually agrees with me regarding this. He says, and I quote him, "Patients need oxygen, not pressure." And if you want to hear hear it directly from him, and he's on the front line on the East Coast, just like we are here on the West Coast, you can watch his short 1 minute, 32-second video by going to YouTube and then typing in the search box this right here. Okay, if you type that link, G3KA8LO_F_Z8, you can listen to him for yourself. Now, that being said, ventilators may in fact still have an effective use in the immediate future for those patients too far gone to recover with this new awareness of old basic principles. But from this point on, the treatment centers worldwide must establish a new treatment protocol and stop treating patients for the wrong disease. Otherwise, there will be a tremendous loss of life unnecessarily. Now, in the last 48 hours or so, since Monday morning, April 6th, we've seen what I believe is a major revelation. If you've been paying attention at all, then you've heard it on the news channels that COVID-19 causes prolonged, progressive hypoxia. Now, hypoxia is a fancy medical term that simply means your body is starving for oxygen. So, how is this happening? Well, SARS-CoV-2, the virus, binds to the heme groups in the hemoglobin in your red blood cells. Now, at this point, I'm going to provide you with a simple understanding of the functional structure of a red blood cell. And for those of you who know this stuff, please don't take offense, because it's simply meant to help those who may not know to understand better. This is not going to be complicated, but it is important that you understand the process, how to make toast. Hemoglobin is a protein found in the red blood cells. It's the substance that gives blood its red color. And its job is to carry oxygen that it picks up in the lungs to the tissues throughout your body. It delivers the oxygen to the cells of your body. So, each human red blood cell, a single cell, contains approximately 270 million of these hemoglobin molecules. 270 million in one red blood cell. Now, each hemoglobin molecule carries 4 heme groups. Now, I know this may get a little complicated, so it may help to just think of the hemoglobin molecules the 270 million that are in one red blood cell, as little cars or trucks, and a heme group as one seat in that car or truck. So the car, the hemoglobin, has only 4 heme groups or 4 seats and can only carry 4 passengers. Now, this heme group, the seat, gives hemoglobin, the car, the ability to bind an oxygen molecule because of the presence of an iron atom in the seat or in the heme group. This iron atom also contributes to the red color found in the muscles and blood. That's why your muscles on a living or a recently deceased person is pink. But after they're dead a while and it's gone, the muscles and the blood is not pink. So each heme group or seat in the car contains an iron atom that's able to bind one oxygen molecule to that iron atom. Thus, each hemoglobin protein, the car, can bind 4 oxygen molecules. But when someone is infected with SARS-CoV-2, the virus binds to the heme group. It sits in the seat in the car. And it prevents the oxygen from getting into the car and sitting in that seat. So instead of the car carrying 4 oxygen atoms, it's carrying no oxygen. It's still circulating through your circulatory system, but it's carrying no oxygen to any of the tissues in your body or its organs. The result of this is what we call desaturation of the blood with oxygen. People are simply losing oxygen in their blood, and this condition is what eventually leads to organ failures that cause them to die. Your body and your organs need oxygen to live. When they're deprived of oxygen, they begin to shut down and you die. This is equivalent to dying slowly from suffocation. It's not that the patients can't breathe, although it may appear that they're having difficulty breathing. It's that there's no oxygen being delivered. Now, it's crucial to understand that there is no form of ARDS, acute respiratory distress syndrome, or pneumonia occurring. All of the damage to the lungs that we see in CT scans as a result, or are a result rather, of the release of oxidative iron from the heme groups in the red blood cells. Again, remember, each of the 4 heme groups or seats in the car, the hemoglobin, contain an iron atom that binds to an oxygen molecule. But when the virus binds to the heme group, or sits in the seat, it ejects the iron atom out of the car. And since there's no iron atom, the oxygen molecule has nothing to bind to. And this progressive condition soon overwhelms the body's natural defenses against pulmonary oxidative stress and causes that nice, always bilateral, both sides, ground glass opacity in the lungs, which is indicative of the disease COVID-19. Now, the fact that cases of patients returning for rehospitalization days or even weeks after recovery, and they're apparently suffering from what is called delayed post-hypoxic leukoencephalopathy. This supports and strengthens the notion that COVID-19 patients are actually suffering from hypoxia, despite no signs of respiratory tire out or fatigue, like with emphysema. So to break it down to a simplified process, just to keep it digestible and layman friendly, your red blood cells carry oxygen from your lungs to all your organs and then the rest of your body. Red blood cells can do this thanks to hemoglobin, the CAR, which is a protein consisting of 4 hemes, or seats in the car. Each seat, or heme, has a special kind of iron ion, which is normally very toxic in its free form. But when it's locked in the car, in the seat, in the heme, it allows the iron ion to be carried around the body safely by the hemoglobin. But it still remains readily available, and it's easily used to bind to oxygen when it gets to the lungs. Now, in your lungs, you have little sacs that are called alveoli. And this is when the red blood cell gets to the alveoli, or these little sacs in your lungs, this is where all the gas exchange happens. Now, that special little iron ion in the heme can change its electrical charge, and this allows it to bind to some oxygen. And then it goes off on its merry little way to deliver oxygen to the body. But this is where COVID-19 comes in. The virus that causes the disease of COVID-19, you've probably seen it, pictures of it on TV. It's round and it's got these little spikes sticking out of it. Well, these little spikes are glycoproteins, and they stick out of its viral envelope. That's the circular membrane. And these are what bind to the heme, or sit in the seats in the car. And in doing so, that special and toxic oxidative iron ion is disassociated or released. And it's basically let out of the car, and now it freely roams around on its own. Now, this is bad for 2 reasons. First, without the iron ion in the hemoglobin can no longer bind to oxygen. And once all the hemoglobin in the red blood cell is impaired, the red blood cell is basically turned into an 18-wheeler truck with no trailer and no ability to store its cargo, which is oxygen. So it becomes useless. It's just running around your body with a SARS-CoV-2 virus attached to it, unable to pick up and carry any oxygen to the tissues of the body. So as it progresses, all these useless trucks running around unable to deliver oxygen is what leads to desaturation of blood with oxygen. And then we begin to see the patient's SpO2 levels drop. SpO2 is a sign, like a vital sign, that we monitor in patients with respiratory problems. SpO2 actually stands for peripheral capillary oxygen saturation. And it's an estimate of the amount of arterial oxygen saturation in the blood. Now, normal SpO2 levels or values vary between about 90 to 100%. And good blood oxygenation is necessary to supply the energy your muscles and organs need in order to function. If your SpO2 value drops below 90%, that's usually a sign of poor blood oxygenation, which is what we call hypoxia, low oxygen content in the tissues. Now, in these cases of COVID-19, it is incorrect to assume traditional acute respiratory distress syndrome. And if you make that mistake, then you're treating the wrong disease. Think of it like carbon monoxide poisoning, where carbon monoxide is bound to the hemoglobin, making it unable to carry oxygen. In those cases, ventilators aren't treating the root cause. The patient's lungs aren't tiring out, like with emphysema, where the muscles aren't strong enough to inhale and exhale. They're pumping just fine. The red blood cells just can't carry oxygen. End of story. Now, in this case, or these cases of COVID-19, unlike carbon monoxide poisoning, where eventually the carbon monoxide can break off of the hemoglobin, here, the affected hemoglobin is permanently stripped of its ability to carry oxygen because it's ejected and lost its iron ion, and there's nothing there to bind to oxygen. Now, the body compensates for this lack of oxygen carrying capacity and deliveries by having your kidneys release hormones like erythropoietin. Erythropoietin tells your bone marrow, where the blood cells are manufactured, the red blood cells are manufactured, to ramp up production of new red blood cells with freshly made and fully functioning hemoglobin. This is the reason that you find elevated hemoglobin and decreased blood oxygen saturation as one of the 3 primary indicators of whether the shit is about to hit the fan for a particular patient or not. So that's the first reason why when the COVID-19 virus binds to the heme in the hemoglobin and releases that toxic oxidative iron ion is bad. The second reason it's bad is that little iron ion, along with millions or billions of its friends released from other hemes, and remember, you have 270 million hemoglobins, the cars, each with 4 iron ions. That's more than 1 billion oxidative iron ions in every single red blood cell in your body. And there are approximately 20 to 30 trillion red blood cells in your body. And now they're floating around through your body freely and toxic. So, as I mentioned before, this type of iron ion is highly reactive and causes oxidative damage. Now, it turns out that this same thing happens to a limited extent naturally in our bodies. And we have cleanup and defense mechanisms to kind of keep the balance. The lungs in particular have 3 primary defense mechanisms to maintain what is called iron homeostasis, or the balance. 2 of these defenses are in the alveoli, those little sacs in your lungs we talked about earlier. The first of these 2 defenses are little macrophages that roam around in your body and scavenge up any free radicals like this oxidative iron. The second defense in your lungs is a lining on the walls of those little sacs in the lung. It's called the epithelial surface, which has a thin layer of fluid packed with high levels of antioxidant molecules, things like ascorbic acid, vitamin C, among others. And this is usually good enough for naturally occurring rogue iron ions, but the COVID-19 virus, when it runs rampant, your body is now basically like a progressive state of letting all the prisoners out of the prisons. It's just too much iron, and it begins to overwhelm your lungs' countermeasures. And this is what begins the process of pulmonary oxidative stress. Now, this condition leads to damage and inflammation, which also leads to all that nasty stuff and damage you see in the CT scans of COVID-19 patient lungs. And as you've heard, and will continue to hear on the news channels as we go through April and on into May, with COVID-19, it's always bilateral, both lungs at the same time. Pneumonia rarely ever does that. But COVID-19 does it every single time. Once your body is running out of control with all of your oxygen trucks, your hemoglobin, running around without any freight, no oxygen, and tons of this toxic form of iron is floating around in your bloodstream, now other defenses start to kick in. While your lungs are busy with all this oxidative stress that they can't handle, and your organs are being starved of oxygen, and your liver is attempting to do its best to remove the iron and store it in its iron vault, but it's getting overwhelmed too because it's starved for oxygen and fighting a losing battle from all your hemoglobin releasing its iron. So your liver starts crying out, "Help, I'm taking damage." And it does this by releasing an enzyme called alanine aminotransferase, or ALT. Boom. There's your second of the 3 primary indicators of whether the shit is about to hit the fan for the patient. Now, eventually, if the patient's immune system doesn't fight off the virus in time, before their blood oxygen saturation drops too low, ventilator or no ventilator, organs start shutting down. No fuel, no work. The only way to even try to keep them going is maximum oxygen. Even a hyperbaric chamber, if one's available, on 100% oxygen at multiple atmospheres of pressure, just to give what's left of their functioning hemoglobin a chance to carry enough oxygen to the organs and keep them alive. And yes, you think we have a shortage on the N95 masks and ventilators that they're trying to get? Well, we don't have nearly enough of these hyperbaric chambers. So, some fresh red blood cells with normal hemoglobin in the form of a transfusion is going to have to do. The central point here being that treating patients with the iron ions stripped from their hemoglobin with ventilator intubation is futile, unless you're just hoping and praying that the patient's immune system will somehow magically work in time. The root of the illness needs to be addressed. So, what's the best case scenario? Well, to begin a treatment regimen early, before symptoms progress too far. Hydroxychloroquine, and I'll get to that in a minute, with azithromycin has shown fantastic promise, along with some zinc, even though the critics keep mentioning, oh, it's only anecdotal. And I'll explain why it does so well in treatment next. But forget about straight up plasma with antibodies. That might work early, but if the patient is too far gone, they'll need more. They'll need all of the blood, the red blood cells, the plasma, and the antibodies. It makes no sense to send over a supply of ammunition to a soldier already unconscious and bleeding out on the battlefield. You need to send that ammo along with something to revive that soldier, wake him up, so that he can fire that ammunition at the enemy. Now, the story with hydroxychloroquine and all that ridiculous, misguided, and counterproductive criticism the media piled on chloroquine, which I believe was purely for political reasons, as a viable treatment, I believe will be recorded as the biggest fake news blunder of all time. The media actively engage in their activism to fight the bad orange man at the cost of thousands of lives. That not only makes me sick to my stomach, it makes me angry. Shame on them. Anyway, so how does chloroquine work for COVID-19? Well, it works in the same manner that it does for malaria. You see, malaria is this little parasite. It's a biological living thing that enters the red blood cells and starts eating the hemoglobin, the car that carries the oxygen, as its food source. The reason chloroquine works for malaria is the same reason it works for COVID-19. And granted, although it's not fully understood, it's suspected to bind to DNA and interfere with its ability to affect hemoglobin. Now, the same mechanism that stops malaria from getting its hands on hemoglobin and gobbling it up appears to do the same thing to the virus known as SARS-CoV-2 to prevent it from binding to hemoglobin. All viruses are essentially little snippets of DNA contained in a viral envelope. They are not living things. And this is why it's commonly proclaimed that antibiotics work only on bacterial infections and not on viruses. Bacteria are living things. Viruses are not. In addition to that, hydroxychloroquine, it's an advanced descendant of the regular old chloroquine, lowers the pH, makes it more acidic, which can also interfere with the replication of the virus. And again, while the full details are not entirely known, the entire premise of this potentially game-changing treatment is to prevent hemoglobin from being interfered with, whether it's due to malaria or SARS-CoV-2. So no longer can the media and the armchair pseudo-physicians sit in their little ivory towers and proclaim, oh, it's ridiculous to use this treatment. Malaria is a bacteria. SARS-CoV-2 is a virus. Antibacterial drugs do not work on a virus. You see, they never got the memo that a drug doesn't need to act directly on the pathogen itself, the bacteria or the virus, to be effective. Sometimes it's enough to just block it or stop it from doing what it does to hemoglobin, regardless of the means it uses to do so. Anyway, I digress. So, what's the end result here? Well, first, the ventilator emergency needs to be re-examined. If you're putting a patient on a ventilator because they're going into a coma and they need mechanical breathing to stay alive, okay, I get it. Give them time for their immune systems to pull them through. But if they're conscious, alert, compliant, keep them on oxygen. Max it if you have to. But if you have to inevitably ventilate, do it at low pressure, but max O2. Don't tear up their lungs with max PEEP, P-E-E-P, or you're doing more harm to the patient because you're treating the wrong disease. PEEP stands for positive end expiratory pressure, and it's widely used to improve oxygenation and prevent alveolar collapse in mechanically ventilated patients with acute respiratory distress syndrome. So, ideally, some form of treatment needs to be established in order to first inhibit viral growth and replication of the virus. Here's where the use of hydroxychloroquine, azithromycin, and zinc can be of value, or other retroviral therapies being studied. The less virus you have, the less hemoglobin losing its iron, the less severity and damage. So, and it's been recently reported that Dr. Vladimir Zelenko, Zelenko, he's a family practitioner from New York, has treated 669 COVID-19 patients in this manner, and there have been 0 hospitalizations, complications, or death. Now, he did not present, in fairness, he did not present any case histories or documents with that. He announced it. So the critics are saying, well, it's not verified, it's not true. Well, maybe it's not, but maybe it is. It's worth the investigation. And so what else needs to be done? Okay, reduce the viral, or inhibit the viral growth and replication of the virus. And 2, we need to utilize therapies that are used for anyone with abnormal hemoglobin or malfunctioning red blood cells. These could be of value, blood transfusions, etc. But we must think along those lines and treat the real disease. If you're thinking about giving them plasma with antibodies, okay, maybe. But if they're already in bad shape, think again. And give them blood with antibodies, or at least blood followed by plasma with antibodies. now that we know more about how this virus works, the process, and how it affects our bodies, a whole range of options should open up to us. So I really hope this information will help people to understand what actually happens to cause people with COVID-19 to die, and also be of help in stimulating other medical professionals, physicians, and researchers in this fight that we're all involved in. I hope all of you are staying safe. And once again, if you found this information helpful, please click the like button below and feel free to share it as you please. One last thing, and I'm not going to get into details, but suffice it to say that there are factions documented that do not want this type of information to be made available to the general public. And some suspicious things have occurred to a number of doctors and other professionals that have gone down this path to make people aware of these things. So I want everyone to know, okay, I am not depressed, okay? I am not considering any type of suicide. I have a very happy life, and I'm looking forward to accomplishing future goals, including a couple of publishing projects that I'm working on. So if by any odd chance something unfortunate were to happen to me, please know without any doubt that I did not commit suicide, and there was some form of foul play involved. My prayers are with all of you, so stay safe, and we will get through this together. Take care.